everybody, this is Tony.
And this is Paul, and we're coming at you from the Friends for Life podcast, where we discuss the ongoing lives and issues of people with developmental disabilities to spark positive change in the field.
And we have a lot of fun doing it.
Making sure that individuals are reaching the goals they have set for themselves. That's one of the many goals of Assured Health Services. If you're looking for a residential care provider or searching for ADS services, Assured Health is your go-to place. Assured Health, helping others succeed. Learn more at assuredhealthohio.com or call 419-442-8066. Kevin, welcome to the Friends for Life podcast. We're very glad that you could join us. We've heard a lot of good things about OOD. We actually met some of your staff coworkers out at a festival in Licking County. So that's kind of how we got connected, a roundabout way, going out in the community. So first things first, we always want to know, how did you end up where you're at in the disabilities field? Because as we've said 1,000 times on this podcast, it's not a very common field for people to go into.
Right. You mean, first of all, Paul and Tony, thank you so much for the time and being able to join this very important podcast that you guys do. You mean in fourth grade when my teacher said, Kevin, what do you want to do? You didn't think I raised my hand and said I'd like to be a bureaucrat that runs a state agency? And that seems so common for what you would want to do. Wanting
never know.
So, yeah, my journey, I think you asked the question for a reason. And I think, my journey, I grew up, I'm from the west side of Columbus, from a very large Irish Catholic family. So I like to always say we put the fun in dysfunction. And, neither of my parents graduated high school, but my parents really, I had an older sister who was born with no upper jaw or upper nasal cavity. So she had went through many surgeries in the 70s when it was much more archaic, I think would be the term that I would use. And so our mother, who was an immigrant from Ireland, really put public service in our heart about doing for others. And so I can remember at a very early age being given a Folgers giant coffee can and going out and collecting money for Jerry's Kids for the telethons in the mid 70s. And as I got older, I went into college and got my degree in criminal justice, and I was working in the correction system. And, my wife and I got married and we had a child. And when he was 4 years old, we got a letter in the mail that said, we'd like to talk to you about Connor and his struggles at school. And, my wife's a speech pathologist and she worked with students with autism. And, as parents, we just didn't see it, and maybe we didn't want to see it. And I remember having him, taking him to a child psychologist and an evaluator, and they said, yeah, he has autism. And it was a real downward spiral for me. I'm very honest about it because I think it's very impactful for other people who go through this. They don't talk about it, but I was a typical angry dad. I was blaming everybody and everything about why this was happening to me. Instead of it really being about my son. And I remember my wife and I went through family counseling, and I remember this counselor, she probably said it 100 times, but I remember one day she said, when are you going to realize it's not about you? And I remember thinking it hit me like a 2x4, and I felt really about this big. And I said, I am not making it about him. I'm making it about myself. And so I realized I needed to change what I was doing. I got out of wanting to work in corrections, and, I had a background in public policy. And so I knew I wanted to get involved and be an advocate. And from that kind of day forward, I knew this is what I wanted to do. So that's kind of how it happened. I was able to get called by then the CASIC administration. They had wanted to talk to me about my experience in corrections, believe it or not. And as we started talking, I told them about my interests and what I wanted to do. And so I was fortunate enough in 2011 to be appointed by Governor Kasich to Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. And even though I got a little bit of gray and not as much hair, I feel like I haven't worked a day since, because I really do feel this is a passion. So, yeah, that's kind of a long-winded answer to tell you how I got to this position.
Well, it's a perfect answer because it's one of those things as well that I constantly see the notion of having family involvement helps create this special, unique, I guess, empathy for other individuals with intellectual delay or a developmental disability. Did you think that we would be to the point that we are now with so much social inclusion and residential inclusion? I mean, there's a lot of individuals who in the past would not have the opportunity to stay in a home setting. Do you think that is going to continue to change, or because of some of the events of the last few years and the underdeveloped staffing issues that we are having, do you think we're going to be kind of like leaning more towards the old ways of doing stuff?
Yeah, Tony, I think it's a great question, and it's something that everybody deals with every single day who has a loved one that has a disability, and they're dealing with very real questions like, how can we make sure, as a parent, I think of a child with a disability, every parent worries about their kid, but I think there's this added burden. And when I talk with other parents, I know my wife and I felt this, one of the first things you think about is what's going to happen when I'm gone. Yeah. Who's going to take care of him or her? No one's going to take care of him the way you do. And so you start making these types of conversations that you're talking about, Tony. And I think one of the things, directly to answer your questions, I think we'll continue to see progress in this area. Now, progress is defined differently by other folks, but I can remember, as a child of the 70s growing up in grade school, when I was in 5th or 6th grade, I had friends who I didn't see except for at lunch and at recess because they were in what was called LD class, or learning disability class, and they were separated. And I remember when my son, those were kind of the things that were in my head, like, oh my God, he's going to be ostracized, he's going to be picked on, he's going to be this. And as we went through the school system, it's not perfect, but the overall concept was we're going to include them and they're going to be mainstreamed. And so when you're going through these things like we're going through right now with how do you deal with home-based services, what about the work shortages, when you're going through it, it's always the most difficult. But when you have some perspective of years behind it, it's kind of like what they talk about with the stock market or whatever. Like, yeah, it's down now, but if you really look at it over a 10-year window and have some perspective, I think it's the same type of thing, the analogy I would use within disability services. I mean, you look how far we've come, just the fact that the ADA Act being signed in 1990, and you're seeing now more and more kids on IEPs, individualized education plans. And I think a lot of policymakers and politicians want to ask, well, does this mean that it's going up, going down? And, studies and research is kind of all over the board on this. But I think a lot of it is the fact that there's greater awareness. So I think with that awareness and the fact that, as I like to say, we've put some points on the board. You see people with disabilities who are living their best lives. I mean, I tell people all the time, you want to see someone with great disabilities who look at Elon Musk, look at Jeff Bezos, look at, all those guys are on the autism spectrum. Look at, some of, John McCain, who was a, United States Senator. These are folks who are great examples of, a reflection of society that have been able to be more accepting. And I think you're seeing society in general being more accepting. And I still think where people, and it's not because they don't want to, but because it's not something that's visible, are the invisible disabilities, which are the majority. So I think you'll see continued progress as you learn new techniques, you learn more information, just like anything else. I think you'll see that continue to evolve.
One thing I've noticed, Kevin, is the word autism is scary for a lot of people because it's just this lump. It's a lump word. It lumps in a lot. I have really great friends that have children with autism who won't look you in the eye, won't say a word to you. And then I have friends with PhDs who have autism and can, deadlift 400 pounds as a woman. There's like a very large spectrum of people with what they call autism. So how does that play out in the general public? Because I think people have a weird conception about what autism is. Mm-hmm. And you hear names like Elon Musk, you hear names like Jeff Bezos and stuff like this, and they think that they're these eccentric, super hardworking, but it's so much more than that. So how do you kind of break that down as a director of an organization that deals with disabilities?
Well, I think, Paul, one of the things that you got to do is you got to meet the people, whoever those individuals with disabilities, you got to meet them where they're at. Mm-hmm. You got to meet them where they're at in their life. You got to meet them at their at of what their desires are. Mm-hmm. You have to meet them where they're at and understand, look, you don't have to have a disability to understand we're all different. We're all unique. We all have our strengths and we all have our weaknesses. Just because somebody has a disability, sometimes that disability can be an advantage. And to your point, I think you've seen where those are the obvious examples. I remember right after my son was diagnosed, I read a book called Diagnosing Jefferson, where there was a college professor whose son was diagnosed with autism. So he just started researching and he started noticing, he was like a psychology professor. And he was like, wow, this sounds like Thomas Jefferson. That sounds like Thomas Jefferson. And so he went back and started reading all of Thomas Jefferson's notes and letters. And he was like, this guy was on the spectrum. And so I think that's where you start to hear this part, Paul, where you say there's this huge lump, and you're right. I mean, Doug Flutie is very prominent for those of us who love football. His son is nonverbal and is not somebody who, is doing, astrophysics and things like that. But there's still value and there's still things that his son has done throughout his life to live a fulfilling life. And so, to your point, I think where we have to, I think this is human nature, we rush to label. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And whether it's, you're male, you're female, you're African-American, you're Caucasian, you're Catholic, you're Jewish, so I think it's human nature. We start to think like, okay, you have autism, or you're blind, or you're deaf, or you're whatever. And so there's this big kind of lump that you're talking about that's there, but there's so many nuances within that. And, and I think if we start to realize just because you have autism, I say this to people, many times I'll get a phone call from a friend of a friend who's like, hey, they just found out their son or daughter has autism. Will you talk to them? I said, sure. As long as you understand, my job is not for me to go, hey, I know how you feel. I said, because the first thing I'm going to say to them is, look, just because I have a son with autism and you have a son with autism doesn't mean I know how you feel. I always like to say, I've never walked in your shoes, but I got a pair of shoes that are like that.
Yeah. There we go. That makes a lot of sense. And so ever since I've been working in this field here at Friends for Life, I've taken a lot more notice in disabilities. I had no experience before working here with Tony, to be completely honest. And seeing people working out in jobs in the public with disabilities is fairly common now. It did not used to be growing up, or maybe I just didn't recognize it. So for OOD, what steps do you help with people getting jobs with disabilities? I mean, from a person with disabilities perspective, maybe, and then from an employer's perspective, how do you guys go about this as an agency?
Yeah, I think the important thing we talk about, when I just said you got to meet them where they're at. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, I will tell you, one of the biggest difficulties, and I see this in how we approached it early on at first as parents, you tend to start thinking about protecting. And you start thinking about when things are brought up, you go, well, I can't send Connor to do that because he wouldn't know how to interact with somebody to do that. Mm-hmm. Instead of maybe what I always say, being like I joke, I'm the youngest of 7, my parents allowed me to fail. We weren't, if you got cut from the basketball team, football team, then it was like you didn't work hard enough. You got to work hard the next time. It wasn't about how do we change the rules for you. And so I think it's important when we start talking about people with disabilities and we work with individuals with disabilities, the first thing we say is, you can do this. If you've come this far, it's about finding the right fit for you, number one. And so it's individualized. So to your point, when you're talking about, hey, autism or deaf, there's varying degrees of those types of things. And so let's start talking about, number one, you can do this. Number two, what are your interests? You know, I always tell the story, Paul, and you guys work in this field, so you know this. You know, my son, who's now 24, I remember when he was like, I don't know, 12 or 11, somewhere in that neighborhood, he loved this show called Swamp People. It's still on. It's on.
Yeah.
And I remember I said, you know, Connor, what do you want to do when you grow up? He's like, I want to be a swamper. And I said, really? I said, well, let's kind of review here. Okay. I said, how far are we to the closest swamp? And of course, he had researched all this stuff and knew. He's like, we're 882 miles to Louisiana. I was like, okay. I was like, have you ever shot a gun? He's like, no. I was like, do you think you'll ever shoot a gun while you're living in my house? And he's like, no. I said, you would like to swim in a pool, let alone a swamp with snakes and all that stuff. I said, you've seen these folks put nasty raw chicken, with their hands. He does sensory issues. And I said, how do you think you're going to do all that? And without even batting an eye, he goes, I'll just hire people to do all that. So the point
that's Tony's answer.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So the point I'm trying to make with that is sometimes the biggest obstacle, and I don't say that lightly, it's not intentional sometimes, is the parents. They're either really unrealistic or they're unrealistic on the short end as well. Like, they can't do anything. How do I get them on Social Security? And I'll say, well, how old are they? And they're like, oh, he's 6. And I'm like, how about we talk about what he could do, or what she could do in the community? What are their interests? Or you have a parent who's like, I don't understand why they're not getting hired by, WBNS TV. He knows everything about a TV, can take a TV apart. And you're like, well, he's nonverbal, and you need to be able to be on air to be able to communicate with people. And so there's these misguided kind of goals. We talk to people when we say, we want to get the maximum amount of work for you that your talents will allow it. Yeah. And what the job market tells us, it doesn't do us any good, for us to make it sound like we're a Make-A-Wish Foundation. Like, hey, Paul wants to be a race car driver. Great, we can do that for you. When it's not going to be in the cards if your diagnosis says you're not going to have a driver's license. Mm-hmm. Telling people what they want to hear versus what you can actually do are two different things. Yeah. So I think as a state agency, we need to meet people where they're at. And I tell my counselors, the hardest thing you're going to have to learn how to say is no. Yeah. And so you've got to be able to be realistic. And then we have to go to the businesses. We call it reverse engineering. We go to the businesses first. And I kind of say the old vocational rehabilitation was we go to you guys as a business and say, hey, hire Kim. It's the nice thing to do. And you go, okay, well, what can Kim do? And, in the 80s, it was, well, we're not going to tell you what to do. You're the business. You figure it out. Well, that doesn't work. In the 21st century, we go to the business and say, what are the jobs that you have that are hard to fill? What are the jobs that you have the most vacancies for? And give us the position description and what are the skills, the specific skills that the individual needs. So we have business relations staff. These are not vocational counselors. These are not social work, psychology background people. They're business people. And when we started this, almost 10 years ago, no one was doing this. And so we were saying across the country, it's okay to understand that we live in a society that the business has to turn a profit. They want to turn a profit. And all of the statistics, all of the empirical data says if you hire individuals with disabilities and you do it the right way by connecting them with what they like, plus what their skills allow them to be good at, the employer likes it because your onboarding costs go down, your retention numbers go up, morale goes up, they don't miss work. So, I think what we try to get across to everybody is I can walk into a legislator who's the farthest of left and the farthest of right, and I can talk about vocational rehabilitation, and there's something there for everybody to like. It is truly something that can be a win-win across society, across business, across families.
Kevin, I think you are so spot on with everything that you said. I think this is almost a PSA for failure for people. Because
feel free to keep running it, Tony, as long as you want. But we want to spread the word as much as possible.
The Reliable Drug and Alcohol Testing Clinic is a leading provider and convenient source of pre-employment and occupational type testing. Their clinic provides services to a wide range of private businesses, healthcare facilities, and municipal and county courts. Reliable is an independent, locally owned clinic. As a result, they provide their services at a lower cost than the major hospitals, have faster turnaround times on test results, and eliminate the long waits typically incurred at these larger facilities. To learn more, visit reliabledrugtest.com.
Yes, we do. Self-efficiency is the number one thing in my life that I think that people need. Just goes back to what you said in the beginning. None of us are going to be here forever, and our loved ones need to be able to cope with surroundings and situations, and we're not doing any favors by constantly coddling instead of, producing facts on, cause and effect. So,
right.
Yeah, and well, I'll say one of the things that I saw the other day. I don't really eat fast food, but I do like to go to Arby's every once in a while. I'll admit that live here on the podcast. And I was in a small town. I was driving somewhere, and I stop in this Arby's, and they have a guy with disability running the cash register. And one thing that I saw, and I was like, this is awesome, is he asked a coworker for help. He obviously was new, like anybody was new. He was asking for help, and the guy didn't talk to him like he was a little kid. He talked to him like we're talking right now, and the guy just like immediately fixed what he was doing. And I was like, that guy right there is awesome who helped him, because most people, when they talk to somebody with a disability, they like almost talk down to them, or they slow down. This guy just talked to him like he was Bob. And I was like, this is amazing. I wonder how much more common that is nowadays, or if he was just a really good guy. But it made me feel good seeing that out in public, because we talk about this on the podcast all the time. We talk about stuff like this all day long, but to see it in real life was great. So,
but you bring up a great point, and I think this is where I talked a little bit earlier about. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's got to be a learned behavior. So the example you're talking about, one of the things we do free of charge is we go out and do disability etiquette training. So nice. I don't know if you guys saw, there's a movie that just came out a couple months ago about a basketball coach who gets fired from the NBA.
And Woody Harris.
And the young girl has Downs. And so the guy comes over and he's like, hey, he's really loud to her. Hey, would you like some water? She's like, I have Down syndrome. I'm not deaf. Yeah. It was just like a bit of humility, in that. And so I think disability etiquette is what we find is people want to be inclusive. They don't know how. Mm-hmm. And, I remember like a lot of people go, is it okay to say to someone who's blind, it's good to see you? And I was like, yeah, and that comes right from the National Federation of the Blind. It's not because Kevin Miller said it. Yeah. So we give tips and we talk to your point, Paul, about, you don't lean down, you don't, change how you talk to that person like they're less than. Mm-hmm. You just talk to them like anybody else that you would. And so I think when you start, what we find is there's momentum that happens with that. When people start to think, and they'll start to also personalize it in their head, where they're like, hey, I remember when I used to work at this place and we would help this person. I didn't really know what that disability was at that time. So, and believe me, I would never be accused of being an optimist, Paul, but I will tell you, I think you're seeing way more momentum now in the workforce about understanding that doesn't, just because someone does some things and you go, wow, that's different, I've never done it that way, it doesn't mean it's wrong or it's bad. It's just different.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And I guess at OOD, it's a big organization. You're helping people get jobs. What are some of the services that you offer overall, so that people who are listening, I'm sure if they have a loved one with disability, they know about it, but maybe there are people who are listening who don't. Because there's always stuff you learn every day in this field. Mm-hmm. So what can people expect if they come to you to be able to work through with you?
I think the first thing we try to tell people is that the success or lack of success is really going to be in your hands. I teach and expect of our folks, if it means it takes a little more work for us, but it makes it easier for our participants, then we'll do that. And I tell my counselors that you may not like it. I may make a decision where you go, I understand why I got to put this in 2 different times in my case notes. But if it makes it easier for the individual, we're going to do it. And so I think what we try to get across to everybody, though, is we can lead you in a very plain way. We can lead you to water, but we can't make you drink. You have to own this process as well. You have to really understand that this is about, do you really want to go to work? And if you don't, that's fine too. But if you really want to work, if you really want to do something, we will do everything humanly possible. And some of those things that we can do, obviously we will do an assessment. This is based out of the United States Department of Education Rehab Services Administration has a code of federal regulations, and it is eligibility based. It's based on functional limitations. There are 7 of them, like communication, mobility, self-care, things like that. Mm-hmm. And so once we get you eligible, we're going to start talking about that journey. What is it that you want to be able to do? And a lot of that's going to be when someone says, hey, I tell people it's also not about your aptitude. If you're coming to us and you're just unbelievably good student, but you want to major in French literature at Ohio State, we're going to tell you that's not in the cards because there's no jobs for French literature majors, right? So I don't want to tell people. It's I told someone the other day. I said, listen, if Neil Armstrong walked in the door and said, hey, I'd like to be an astronaut, I go, we don't have a manned space program right now, but what is it about astrophysics that we could get you involved in, right? So again, it's not about not doing what you want to do. It's about what does the marketplace, and this goes back to what I was talking about, Tony, where you got to understand what does the market bear. It doesn't do me any good to have you prepared to do something that there's no job for, because all you're going to do is get discouraged and angry about why, someone is it because of my disability? No, there's no jobs for that. Yeah. So that's part of that educational process as we start building what's called individual plan for employment. And so that could mean like if we do an assessment, our counselors do an assessment and we say, Tony wants to work in broadcasting. One of the things he's going to have to do is write a script. He's not very good at typing. So in his assessment, so let's get Tony signed up for some typing classes at Columbus State or the local Career Tech Center. And that's something we can pay for. So we would send Tony, through a provider to take those classes free. We pay for that, but it's free of charge for the participant. We see how good Tony does in that. Maybe now an intermediate course is something that we do. One of the other things we've noticed is Tony has to learn how to, because he's going to be on camera, he's going to dress. Now you're going to think I'm slamming you, but I'm not. Dress professionally, right? And say, so we need to teach him what it means from a social skills standpoint when someone says, hey, you need to dress professionally, what that means. So we might send them through a life skills course to teach them things like, how to be able to read social situations. What does it mean when someone says it's casual versus this is business attire or whatever that may be?
Right.
So those are the things that we start to construct. And then I think when they're ready to get into what we call job ready status, and sometimes this could be a matter of months to a matter of years, we start thinking about how do we give you now experiences? So we look at internships and externships and things like that to give them, I think we all probably, what you think it is versus what it really is are two different things sometimes, right?
Yes.
And so sometimes giving them that experience, and I say this all the time, people with disabilities have a right to go, you know what, this isn't what I thought it was. I don't want to do this. We all did that. I remember in college, I was working in landscaping. And I was like, this is not for me. I don't want to do this. This Irish pale skin burns really quick. So this is not for me to be out 14, 15-hour days in the sun.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes people get this idea in their head, like, well, Kevin has a disability and we tried it and it didn't work. Well, you know what? We've all tried jobs that didn't work. You got to show some grade. They're allowed to do that too. It's finding the right fit. So that's where we talk about businesses. We talk about employers. It's trying the right fit, just like we all do, whether you have a disability or not. And I think it's educating the employers about that. But more often than not, if you do all that work up front, and one of the statistics, we measure a lot of things that one of the things I'm most proud of is the national average for retention for people who are still working in the job that we place them in as a vocational rehabilitation program is about 40% nationwide after 1 year of service. Ohio's at 55. So we're 18% higher. So I think that shows quality. Like, hey, they're in a job and they're staying in that job. That the employers like that. And guess what? They're going to want to call us again when they have openings because they see that it's intentional. So that's the approach we try to take.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think the thing with being realistic with people is a lot of time people don't want that because it can be a little hard to hear. But it never is a bad thing, in my opinion, because wait till you get the job. They're going to be really realistic with you, and they're going to be like, we don't want you to do this anymore. You're fired. Right. So, no, I think that's a great thing. And a lot of times we see, especially back to the parent thing, you see people coddling and they're telling them, they're trying to protect whatever. And it's like, well, that's not the best. When that happens, when people beat around the bush and aren't direct about things sometimes, it makes it worse in the long run because you're getting this false hope. And I find that being realistic either sets you where you need to be or makes you mad enough to do what you think you want to do anyways. So it's always a win-win, in my opinion.
Really?
But, I think to your point, there's a difference between giving people honest feedback. It's the way you do it. I kind of call it like with doctors. It's all about bedside manner, right? I mean, do you want a doctor who comes in and goes, dude, you got cancer and you got 3 months to live? Or do you want a doctor who comes in and says, listen, the prognosis is not what we had expected. Here's the likelihood of where your life expectancy could be in these things. And that him or her doctor is reading your response and what your questions are like. So what are you trying to say? And what are you doing this? They're able to read like, should I go deeper into that or not go deeper into that? And so it's the same difference when you're talking about in this. It's really about bedside manner. It's about being realistic. Doesn't mean that I trash what you want to do. It's about how do I get you to view it in a way that you're thinking it's one way, and you got to understand it's not that way in the real world. But if you want to get to something like that, these are some of the things that we could explore together. Are you willing to do that?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing.
Definitely. Funny little research thought about that. I remember reading something that talked about, I want to say it was roughly 80% of people were asked, it was like an 8 out of 10 scenario. They asked them if they were getting fired, how would they want their employer to fire them, to be straight up or to be very, to be somber about it. And 80% of them said that they would want it to be straight up, just rip the Band-Aid.
Yeah.
Right. But I have a hard time believing that is actually
I have a hard time believing it too. It's kind of like, Tony, everyone says they don't mind change until it's them that has to change. Right?
That's right. Well, we're now at a special part of the show that it feels like it's been a long time since I've done it, but it's time for Rapid Fire. Rapid Fire is a part of the show in which I ask you 3 questions. The questions are put in the Would You Rather format, and the quicker you answer, the better it looks for the show, but I tend to go off course and why people answer what they answer. So, Kevin, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, buddy. First one. Would you rather be a Disney prince or a Marvel superhero?
Marvel superhero.
Now, bonus, who?
Probably Captain America.
There you go. You give that cap vibe. All right. Would you rather go water skiing naked at a lake or fight a fire in fresh cotton?
Probably have to go with the water skiing. Less
Smart
dangerous.
move. Yeah, nothing
More
in the lake's going to
embarrassing,
bite
but
you.
less dangerous.
Yeah, right. All right, lastly, would you rather eat a swamp gator or a turtle from PetSmart?
Swamp gator.
Yes, they it's going to be fresher too.
Well, that was interesting. Good
Yes,
answers.
great
I think you
work,
picked
good
all the
work.
right answers. Those are the answers I would have picked
That's
too.
good. I didn't know if these were right or wrong answers, but I tried to answer as quickly as possible.
You did great.
What is it? That one show with whose line is it anyway? The
Yeah.
said something and the points don't matter. That's like
yeah.
how this is. I
Pretty
don't remember the
much.
catch line. So, Kevin, before we wrap up, know you're a busy man. You got a lot going on. You got a lot of people, jobs to get out there.
Yes.
Is there any new stuff that OOD is working on or you're working on specifically that you're really excited about that people can look forward to coming up? Maybe some new initiatives, maybe some new programs, anything along those lines?
Yes. And thank you for asking that question, because one of the things that Governor DeWine has placed in this budget, which is due to, if everything goes through, and it's went through the House, it's in the Senate right now, it needs to be by law signed by July 1. I had talked with the governor last summer about this initiative that we've kind of come to learn a lot about different things through working with businesses and people with disabilities. And the governor asked me, he said, Kevin, what are some of your big plans for this budget? And I said, Governor, we've got this idea we're kicking around. I said, but there's no one doing this in the country that we're aware of from a statewide perspective. And I said, Governor, if we want more people with disabilities, because we can start working with them at age 14, I said, if we want more, parents and students to be able to understand employment and what they could do and have a career and things. I said, and he's a fisherman, so I used it in terms. I said, Governor, you got to stock the pond if you want to fish. And I said, we've got to stock the pond. And I said, right now, you have parents who, I think about my experience and a lot of other parents, when they first find out, they start going through this protectionism kind of thought process about, hey, the kids are going to Kings Island and while, my son is in a wheelchair or my daughter is blind, they can't go to Kings Island. Why not? So we've got to start changing from what I call a universal design standpoint. And so in this budget, what has been proposed, and it's passed through the House and we're knocking on wood through the Senate next week, is something called Accessible Ohio. And what this will allow us to do is hire 5 accessibility specialists. These will be folks who have either an occupational therapy, physical therapy, certified in ADA, to go out and work with venues. So things like museums, ballparks, zoos, and be able to talk about how would someone who's blind, someone who's deaf, someone who has sensory issues, someone who's in a wheelchair, how would they be able to, be able to get on your website to see what is accessible for them to maybe enjoy going to COSI or the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And then what are the things that are at that venue that can help them enjoy that experience because of their disability? So we are super excited about this. The governor was juiced about it because he's big about, if no one else is doing it, then this is a good thing. It makes total sense. As I talked with members of the House and members of the Senate, they were like, hey, we have some ideas, so that's always a good thing. They're not throwing you out of the office.
Right.
So we're really excited about this, and we're hoping, when the budget's signed July 1, we will have a huge kickoff. We've already been getting calls. For instance, today, we're doing disability etiquette and awareness training for the TSA agents at John Glenn Airport in Columbus. I can't tell you how many times talking with individuals with disabilities, their experience in going through TSA or some other things has been, let's just say, less than desirable.
We actually did that. We actually did an
I guess you
episode
don't have
about
to have
that
a
too.
disability to go along with that. But and again, I think it's a matter of not knowing. They've and I'm painting with a broad brush, but I've had some individuals say things like, well, you got to go through the metal detector without your leg braces, or you can't go through in a wheelchair. And they're like, well, how am I supposed to be, checked with this? And so it's that bedside manner we talked about, right? Look, we want to be able to travel safe. We want to be able to make sure the TSA agents do their job. But how do you make sure you understand that you can't just treat everybody exactly the same when someone's coming up and they're blind or they're deaf? How do you make sure you want them to know your commands? But if you're not thinking about how they receive the commands, then you're not helping. So I think I want to give kudos to the TSA here in Columbus, and we're looking to make that something that's routine. And, when we met with the leadership at the airport, they were talking about how they're going to build a new terminal. And they're like, we want to talk to you about this Accessible Ohio to make sure from the ground up and the design that everything is accessible. So this is something we're really excited about. It's one of our crown jewels in this budget that we're talking about. So hopefully after July, I can come back and give you guys an update on some of the great things we're looking to do at these venues. So that's probably one of the biggest things that we're doing. And I certainly would want to make sure I tell all our listeners, whether yourself or a loved one is interested in work and they have a disability, I want you to go to our job portal. I always like to say it's very non-governmenty. It's not one of these things you got to do a whole bunch of clicks. It was designed specifically for people with disabilities to go to, and it's oodworks.com. And it's a self-paced tutorial for you to be able to go through and ask yourself questions. You can schedule an appointment with one of our counselors to get the ball rolling for you if that's what you want to do. And you can do it at 2:00 in the morning if that's what you want to do. So oodworks.com. I'd love for anybody who thinks somebody would be interested in wanting to start a career or want to be able to see if works for you. We want to be here to do that for you. So that plus the Accessible Ohio are our two big things we're really excited about with this budget.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. We really appreciate all the work you do and everything that OOD does, everybody that makes jobs more accessible for people with disabilities.
Yes.
It's a great thing. So we really appreciate that. And thank you for talking with us today. It's been very enlightening for me, and I learned a lot. I hope our listeners are learning a lot. So thank you guys very much.
Well, thank you. And let me just say also, I want to thank you guys for doing things like this and also bringing to light the people who are at the tip of the spear, like you guys who are working directly with folks that are making a difference for people with disabilities. So thanks for having me.
Appreciate that very much. THS Remote Supports is clearly focused on improving independent living through dynamic and personalized services. Their systems have been carefully developed and perfected to ensure that everyone receives the best care through the least intrusive means possible. Located in Cincinnati, Ohio, they've spent over 20 years providing in-home supports to individuals with disabilities. If you or someone you know is looking for a remote service provider, go to thsrss.com or call 513-882-9088.